Hi guys, in the past couple of years we've been talking a lot about all the different elements that have to be taken into account while designing an effective training program. And today we're going to put it all together and see how it all fits on the bigger picture without going too deep on anything specific. So the assumption is that you already have some basic understanding of training methodology. And if you've been following this channel for some time, you probably are good to go. But otherwise, the information is there, guys. I know these videos look deceptively simple because I'm just standing here and talking, but in reality, I'm combining information from hundreds of books and magazines for you guys here and trying to summarize it in the most coherent and comprehensive manner possible. And today, we're going to put all those different pieces of puzzle together. So it should be a very interesting video. Let's start by talking about some of the general considerations that have to be taken into account while designing an effective training program. And the first one's pretty obvious. Why are you doing this? What is your goal? And it could even be something like a dream, because it just has to be specific enough to give us some sort of direction. You might have heard an expression, you can't hit a target if you don't know what it is. And just because you're expending energy doesn't necessarily mean that you actually getting anything accomplished. So for example, I could run in place here all day without actually getting anywhere. People talk a lot about having to work hard, but you also have to work smart. And that's what this channel is all about. It's about getting the most out of the time and effort you spend at the gym without having to take steroids. And having a clear vision of what you're trying to accomplish is a good place to start. And so that would be an analogy to a long-term goal. So for example, my dream is to be Mr. Olympia. But now I have to figure out how to actually get there and what does it take to be a Mr. Olympia. So I have to have sufficient muscle mass. I have to have well-balanced physique. I have to have certain percentage of body fat. But since our time and resources are limited, it is not always possible to accomplish all of those things at the same time. And then on top of that, training modes that are optimal for developing some qualities could actually be incompatible with training modes that are optimal for developing others. So for example, things that I do to lose body fat could actually interfere with me trying to gain muscle mass, which requires that the training process is broken down into more manageable pieces, which is what short-term goals are all about. The second factor we have to take into account is our training experience. And as most of you probably know, the beginner is somebody who's been trained for less than 1 year. Now the intermediate is a little more vague, but somewhere around 2 to 3 years after the beginner stage. And the advanced is what comes after. Now, we are talking about proper training here and not just how long you had a gym membership for. And it's very important to be humble about this and realistically determine where you actually fall, because that will enable you to select the training methodology that is the most appropriate for your level. Because the word advanced is not synonymous to the best in this context. So for example, when people talk about the most advanced fighter jet, what they're implying is that that is the best fighter jet. But that's not what it means here. And so for example, if the beginner decides to skip to something like 5-3-1, that training program is designed to increase your main lifts by 5 to 10 pounds about once a month, which would actually be a pretty slow rate of progress for beginner. And that's why something like starting strength would probably be more appropriate. So once again, it's very important to understand what this actually means. And we spoke about this in one of my previous videos, but you can also check out Practical Programming by Mark Ripito. He does an excellent job explaining this topic. The third factor that we have to consider is what have you been doing in the gym lately? And this is important due to the following reasons. So number one is to avoid accommodation. So I'm sure you have heard everything works but nothing works forever. And what that actually means is that you have to employ at least some type of variation to avoid stagnation with your training. Now the second one is to maximize transfer. So let's look at the following example. Let's say I decided to focus on bodybuilding for 2 months, after which I decided to switch to long distance running for 2 months, after which I decided to focus on powerlifting for another 2 months. Now, the gains that I made was my muscle mass during the bodybuilding phase will have very little benefit during the following long distance running phase. And if anything, all that additional weight will probably hinder my performance, at least initially. Now, the improvement with my endurance that I attained during the long distance running phase will have very little benefit during the following powerlifting phase, because endurance is a very insignificant component of powerlifting. So hopefully this example illustrates how that type of planning would be very far from optimum, and if anything, I would be just wasting my time. And that's why it's very important to sequence different phases of training in the way where each following phase is benefiting from the gains made during the previous phase, which is what phase potentiation is all about. Now, the third one here is to allow recovery. So you should know that after a period of very hard training that could be considered something like concentrated loading, where you know that you were overreaching, you have to schedule periods of lighter training to allow recovery and avoid overtraining. And mental aspect is a big part of it. And just to be clear, I'm not talking about shuffling things around to prevent boredom here, because I personally never get bored during training. And if there was a training program that keeps giving me good results, I will keep using that program for as long as it's working. And if it's not working, that's a little different story. But what we are talking about here is taking a break from a gym wars, because, for example, no matter how much you love training, you will still need periods of time where you sort of kind of step back and decompress a little bit. And another part of this is that it's much easier to push yourself when you see the light at the end of the tunnel. So for example, when you have 500 pounds on your shoulders, it is much easier to squeeze out that extra rep when you know that you have a deload in a couple of weeks, while otherwise you might just play it safe and sort of try to conserve your energy. So these are some of the considerations that you have to take into account while designing a training program. And it's very important to understand that none of this should happen by accident. You don't make progress by accident. You don't overtrain by accident. And you should be knowledgeable enough to be able to predict different outcomes of various decisions that you're making while designing a training program, which will necessitate at least some level of planning in your training process, which of course brings us to the topic of periodization. So we're going to try to uncomplicate all this today. And all periodization really is how you structure your training. And that has different implications when you're looking at a training process on different levels. So think of Google Maps for a moment. Let's imagine we decided to look at New York State, and now all we can see is different cities. Now, if I was to zoom in on a particular city, now I'm able to see what different blocks look like. If I was to zoom in on a particular block, now I'm able to see what different buildings look like. It's the same thing here. Like I said, this is just looking at training process on different scale, and this just happened to be the terminology that people are using. So roughly speaking, when we're talking about microcycle, we are talking about matter of days. When we're talking about mesocycle, we are talking about matter of weeks. And when we're talking about macrocycle, we are talking about matter of month. So like I said, we're not splitting atoms here, and just because I drew a little graph here doesn't mean that I'm ready to apply for NASA engineering. So now let's talk about what these things actually mean. And the easiest way to think of a macrocycle is something like a season. So something that has some kind of finale at the end of it. Obviously, it's a lot easier if you actually compete, because your preparation for competition will be your macrocycle. But even if you don't compete, it is still very beneficial to have a specific date on which you're going to conduct some type of formal evaluation of your progress. So for example, I personally love to train, and I always train very hard. But I can honestly tell you that when I have a fight date on my calendar, somehow I train even harder, because having that deadline gives you this sense of urgency where you get tunnel vision and you just start to execute. So I highly recommend that even if you don't compete, you schedule dates on which you're going to perform some type of assessment. And obviously it's a little more straightforward if you are a strength athlete, because you just max out on your lifts. But even if you are more of a physique athlete, you can still take pictures in different bodybuilding poses, or perform various body measurements, such as like skin fold measurement, for example. I highly recommend that you actually do it because it makes things a lot more fun and can even reignite your passion for this. And next thing you know, during the following macro cycle, you are even more disciplined with your diet or maybe even training harder. So now let's talk about mesocycles. As you might remember earlier, we said that sometimes long-term goals have to be broken down into smaller, more manageable pieces. And that's what mesocycles are all about. It's the period of time allotted to develop in a specific quality. And they are usually 3 to 6 weeks. So anything less than 3 weeks and you're probably not making any meaningful progress. Because for example, if yesterday you were building muscles, today you're trying to get stronger and tomorrow you're trying to lose weight, you're probably not getting very far. On the other hand, if it's much longer than 6 weeks, you might start running into problems of accommodations. But there are exceptions to this because some mesocycles have variation built into them. So my first advanced training program would be a good example of that. And if anything, it would probably be foolish to use that program for just 3 weeks. So these are some of the common types of mesocycles that are used in resistance training. So we have volume and intensity, preparation and competition using weightlifting, accumulation, realization, and hypertrophy and strength. Now these columns are not exactly the same thing, although they are similar, because when you are on this side, you are probably training with higher volume but lesser intensity. And when you are on this side, you are probably training with higher intensity but lesser volume. So this is what this wavy pattern is coming from. Although in real life it wouldn't exactly look like that, because when you are in hypertrophy phase, for example, you could keep your intensity constant while the volume would be increasing. So something like step loading, for example. Now these periods over here used to be referred to as transitional periods, but more commonly known as deloads these days. So as you probably know, their purpose is to allow you to recover from the last few weeks of the previous mesocycle when your hardest training was probably taking place. And how much you're going to have to step back will obviously depend on how hard this training was. And the way I personally do it is that I start each new mesocycle with the weights that I know are going to feel as a joke. So while I'm taking a breather, I'm still kind of hinting to my body that it's time to readjust because we are moving into a different mesocycle. Now obviously it is beneficial to schedule these periods during the time when you won't be able to train very hard anyway. So like family vacation or during the week where you're planning to move to a different apartment. But that's just a benefit of planning ahead of time. There are many other types of mesocycles, but for our purposes we're going to focus mostly on these. And the only one I'm going to add here is the GPP, General Physical Preparation Training. And although that could be a whole separate video, I'm just going to mention briefly here how I personally utilize them. So sometimes, no matter how meticulous I am with my calculations, and I'm moving from high volume to high intensity and so on, and I still fail to make any significant progress. And you will not always know what happened. Perhaps you miscalculated. I personally suspect it has something to do with the insulin sensitivity, because those are also the times when I start noticing that I am getting fat for no particular reason. But in any case, those are usually the times when I interject a GPP block of training. And I always use my strength and conditioning phase that I presented about a year ago. And somebody noticed that the way that program is presented in the video is not exactly the same as in my book, Fit in 1 Year. But the reason for that is that in that book, that program is only part of much broader training plan. And that's why it doesn't look exactly the same. But let's just go back to the level of macrocycle for a moment. So the way you schedule different mesocycles during a particular macrocycle is that you are moving from the variation to specificity. So you always want to finish macrocycle with the mesocycle that is the closest to whatever you're going to be tested on. And so, for example, if you're a bodybuilder, obviously you want to finish with the hypertrophy mesocycle. If you're a powerlifter, you want to finish with the strength mesocycle. And by definition, GPP is the least specific training that you could possibly be doing. So just make sure that you don't schedule that type of training too close to the finish line. So now we are down to the level of a microcycle. And so this is what your actual training program is going to look like during a particular mesocycle of training. And obviously it's going to be very specific to whatever mesocycle you are currently in. And the only thing we're going to add to that is that they are usually 1 week long, which is a matter of pure convenience. But before we go any further, I just want to say something real quick here. As you might have noticed, this discussion is very, very dense because I'm trying to cover a very broad topic in this video. And if you feel that some of this information is sort of flying over your head, perhaps it will be a good idea for you to pause this video and go back to some of the videos that are posted on this channel earlier. And more specifically, my Theory of Strength Training playlist. You can also check out my books on Amazon, and if you watch this video on YouTube, I will include links to them in the description. Because as I said in the beginning, this is more of a summary, and you would be able to absorb this information at a very different level if you already have some basic understanding of all the different elements that we are trying to combine here. So now let's see how all that applies in actual training. And we're going to start with bodybuilding. Now, unfortunately, sophisticated planning is rarely utilized in the field of bodybuilding. And variation is usually achieved by simply shuffling things around, something known as principle of muscle confusion. And the only more or less accepted way of structuring your training in bodybuilding is breaking it into periods of bulking and cutting. And as most of you probably know, bulking is when you're focusing on increasing the muscle mass, and cutting is when you're trying to maintain the muscle mass while focusing on decreasing the body fat percentage to further display your muscles. Now, as we will see in a moment, this is still very much viable way of structuring your training if it's done properly. But unfortunately, guys usually just talking about bulking and cutting. But in reality, that training stays exactly the same. So let's talk about how this is traditionally being implemented. So when it comes to bulking, during this time, you will be mostly utilizing big compound exercises such as squats, deadlifts, bench press, shoulder press, bend over rows, dips and pull-ups, and so on. Now the reps will be from 8 to 4. Just a quick note here, the reps in bodybuilding is very much a matter of a personal preference. And the only more or less accepted rule is that muscle groups such as forearms, calves, and abs will get higher reps than the rest of the body. Now, during this time, you will be utilizing explosive style of muscle exercise execution, which combined with longer rest breaks should enable you to lift heavier weights. And all this combined with the higher caloric intake should help you to grow muscle mass. Now, when it comes to cutting, now you can also add some of the isolation movements to fine-tune various details of different muscle groups. The reps will be higher from 8 to 15 usually, and you will also be utilizing slower speed of exercise execution, which combined with shorter rest breaks should help you to chase that pump a little more. And all this combined will probably necessitate that you use weights that are lower from what you use during the bulking phase, which is actually very logical if you take into account that during this time you'll probably be intaking fewer calories. Now, this is very much outside of the scope of this video, but just a few words on that topic. So it used to be that back in the days that guys would focus on cutting down on fats during this time, but it seems that the more current trend is to cut down on carbs. Now, there is a lot of nonsense in the field of nutrition, probably even more so than in the field of resistance training, and that's why I decided to take a minute and to recommend a book here for you guys if you feel that you are getting lost in all the information. And the book is Championship Bodybuilding by Chris Ossetto, and I'm probably mispronouncing his name or his last name because I don't personally know the gentleman, but I really like the book. So half of this book is about training, and that part is also very good, and another half is about nutrition. And which are considered to be the most valuable, because he gives you very strong basics on what nutrition should look like in bodybuilding. And it also gives you the tools to further evaluate all the current trends without, drowning in all the information. Now, he also talks quite a bit about different supplements, but you're going to have to decide on your own how important that part is for you. But back to this. So even if we were to disregard the nutrition part, as you can see, just based on this is still a very sensible way of structuring your training, because just doing this alone will give you plenty of variation, and it also will keep things mentally fresh. So something that we talked about earlier in this video, because at the end of this block of training, you are probably very much looking forward to taking a break from the bone crushing weights. And at the end of this block of training, you're probably very much looking forward to taking a break from this punishing pace, from feeling the burn, from feeling out of breath all the time. And by the way, this is, if you utilizing my strength and hypertrophy rotation, this is how different those phases of training should look like, should feel like rather. So like I said, this is still very sensible way of structuring your training. So now let's talk about what things are going to look like at the level of a microcycle. And we're going to start with the schedule. Now, I imagine not too many professional bodybuilders are watching this video, and that's why I'm going to start by saying that a lot of this will depend on how much free time you have. But besides that, these are some other important factors that you have to take into consideration while designing a training program. And when it comes to bodybuilding, training programs are almost always split routines. So if you're not sure what that is, it's basically you're combining exercises for the same muscle group together. And broad split is probably the easiest way to illustrate it, because in broad split, you come to the gym and you focus on only one muscle group. So for example, Monday's chest, Tuesday's back, Wednesday's shoulders, and so on. And that's probably one of the most rudimentary ways to utilize split routines. Now, another one I don't really like that much is the upper-lower body split. And the reason for that is because if you think about it, when it comes to bodybuilding, there are just many more things on the upper body that require your attention than when it comes to the lower body. And that's why I don't think upper-lower body split tends to be very balanced. Now, it is also possible to utilize whole body routines, and this is something that abbreviated training utilizes. But we spoke about that in one of my previous videos already. Now, when it comes to the frequency in bodybuilding, you train usually 3 to 6 times a week. Now, besides how much free time you have, this will greatly depend on your recovery capabilities. So things that we discussed in my energy budget video. Now, I know that this channel is about getting big and strong without steroids, and a lot of people might be a little concerned with this number here, but you just have to understand that we are looking at the big picture here. So I've been training for almost 3 decades, and it's not like I never trained 6 times a week. And you just have to understand while you're doing it that you are overreaching, and this is probably not something that you're going to be able to sustain for a very long time. Now, while I'm doing it, I also understand that I am probably not going to make any progress during that time or during the time immediately after, because it will take my body some time to fully recover, and only then I will be able to collect the dividends from the high volume, high frequency training that I done earlier. And I think this is something that happens when people switch to heavy duty, high intensity training, because initially they get all these great results and they contribute it all to the new methodology they're using, while in reality they probably just finally got a chance to recover from whatever high volume routine they were using earlier. But that doesn't mean that they're going to be able to get such great results for a very long time while utilizing such ultra low volume training methodology. Besides deciding on how many training sessions you're going to have per week, you also have to figure out how often you're going to train each body part per week. And in bodybuilding, it's usually 1 to 3 times per week. Now, when you're spreading out training sessions for various body parts on your weekly schedule, it is very important to take into account overlap. And this is not something that is often being discussed, so let's spend a couple of minutes talking about it. And so what this basically means is that, as most of you probably know, most of the exercises in resistance training involve more than just one muscle group. So for example, most people know that when you do bench press, besides your chest, your anterior shoulders and your triceps also get stimulated. And so for example, if today I had shoulder training session and tomorrow I'm training chest, now the fatigue in my shoulders could be potentially limiting my performance during the tomorrow's training session for chest. And on top of that, that training session will probably be interfering with the recovery of my shoulders from the training session that I had the day before. So hopefully it's pretty obvious how all that is not optimal. Now here I listed some of the muscle groups that have significant overlap in their training. And so we have legs and back, back and shoulders, shoulders and chest, chest and triceps, triceps and shoulders, and back and biceps. Now, one of the ways to deal with this would be to group related muscle groups together. So for example, legs push pull split would be a good example of that. But I personally don't like that very much, because first of all, when you group related muscle groups together, sometimes the assault could be too concentrated. So for example, if you ever train the legs and back together and you're utilizing heavy exercises such as squats, deadlifts, bend over rows, and so on, now that workout would be hell on your lower back. And then on top of that, grouping related muscle groups together makes their training very, very infrequent. So for example, if I'm training each body part only once a week, and then on top of that, I decided to train my chest, shoulders, and triceps together, now those muscle groups really get only one training session per week. And I don't like that very much. And that's why I like to spread it out a little more, because although that's a little more tricky, I feel like even if you still train each body part only once a week, but you spread it out properly, in reality what tends to happen is that each body part ends up having at least one more additional training session. So for example, if I am training my biceps on Thursday and I consider that to be my primary biceps training session, and on top of that I have a back training session on Monday, that would be like an analogy of a light training session for biceps. So you can see how I would be almost attaining some level of undulating loading, while in reality I'm still training each body part only once a week. And you can check out both of my hypertrophy phases to see how I'm navigating this. And it's a little tricky and you can never really get it perfect, but one of the main rules while navigating this is that you should never schedule these muscle groups, training sessions for these muscle groups on consecutive days. Now the second thing we're going to talk about is the volume. And the volume in bodybuilding is determined by the number of sets. Now it should be pretty obvious that this will depend greatly on the frequency of your training. Because if you train 3 times a week, you're probably doing much less volume than if you train 6 times a week. And this is probably a good time for us to stop and point out how interrelated all these things are. And for that reason, I'm not providing you with any specific recommendations regarding to how many sets you should be doing per each body part. But instead we'll stick to general recommendations. And the way you split up the volume in bodybuilding is that the bigger the body part is, the more sets that body part will get. So you'll probably be doing a lot more work for your quads than for your biceps, for example. Now, another thing that you have to take into consideration is your weak and your strong areas. So for example, if you feel that your triceps is already ahead of the game, but your biceps is lagging behind, perhaps it would be a good idea for you to spend more time on your biceps and not as much on your triceps. And overlap is also have to be considered here, because if you remember, triceps also get stimulated during your chest training session and your shoulder training session. And if you feel that it's already far ahead of the game, perhaps you wouldn't even need too much additional work and you could put that energy to use somewhere else. Once you figure out the number of sets for a particular muscle group, Now we have to decide on what exercises we're actually going to do. And here we want to take into account the fact that we want to target the same muscle group from different angles to ensure well-balanced development. So for example, when it comes to our shoulders, we want to make sure that we have some work for our anterior deltoids, for our lateral deltoids, and for our posterior deltoids. And here, once again, overlap has to be taken into account, because going back to our shoulder example, now we have to remember that our anterior deltoids get a lot of stimulation during the chest training. And so when it comes to our primary shoulder train session, perhaps we won't need much more additional work for that area. Now, another thing to take into account here is that the same muscle group can have various levels of development of its different parts. So for example, if our upper chest is lagging behind our lower chest, perhaps we can schedule more sets in exercises that target upper chest and fewer sets in exercises that target lower chest. The last one in the volume section is the MRV, maximum recoverable volume. This is something that is advocated by Mike Israetel, and roughly speaking, what he states is that by trial and error, we can all determine the optimum number of sets for different body parts and then utilize that information while creating a training program. Now, I like this as a concept, but not so much when people start talking about specific numbers. And I think this is something that resonates with the current obsession with individualization of training. And it's kind of cool to say that MRV for my bicep is 7, but for my chest is 11. But in reality, there are just simply too many moving parts during training process for you to be able to make such claims. So for example, if I'm training 3 times a week while utilizing whole body routines and my biceps is all the way at the end of that training session, I might feel that MRV for my biceps is 3 sets. While on the other hand, if I'm training 6 times a week and my biceps gets its own training session, I might feel that MRV for my biceps is 30 sets. So I hope you can see my point. And I don't want to hate on this too much, because at least somebody's trying to make sense in this field. And the only thing I would say is that use it as a concept, but don't get hung up too much on any specific numbers. We are finally down to the intensity. Now, the weights that you are using during your training session is considered to be a secondary thing in bodybuilding. And the intensity is measured by the subjective amount of effort. And most of your work sets will be taken to the failure. Now, here once again we have to remind ourselves that all these things are interrelated. And as you remember, when I had that graph here, we said that intensity will be inversely related to the volume. So if you're planning 30 sets for your back, you probably won't be able to go Dorian Yates, blood and guts on every single one of that. So this will require some sort of discretion on your part. And in order to combat that subjectivity, more and more recently you start seeing these 2 acronyms. So let's talk about what they actually mean. Now, these 2 things are actually 2 sides of the same coin. So this stands for reps in reserve, and this is rate of perceived exertion. And this scale is from 0 to 10, with 10 being the highest, the maximum effort. Now let's imagine that there was a weight that I could only lift 5 times with my best effort. And if I lift that weight 5 times, my reps in reserve is 0, and my effort is 10, the maximum effort. Now if I lifted that weight 4 times, I left 1 rep in reserve, and my effort is 9, and my RPE is 9. And if I lifted that weight 3 times, I left 2 reps in reserve, and my RPE is 8. You see how that goes. Now, I'm more accustomed to the RPE, Borg RPE scale, which is on a scale from 6 to 20. And although that scale is a little more vague, I actually kind of prefer it, because that kind of implies that at least some of it, that is a general recommendation, and at least some of it is on you. While this is a little more specific. Now, although there is definitely utility to this, I think at the same time this can give you this false sense of precision, while in reality these things are still very much subjective. So for example, if I was to create a training program while using these things as guidelines, and then present that training program to somebody who has type A personality and type B personality, their interpretation of the same training program would be wildly different. So just something to keep in mind, that most of these things are still very much subjective. Luckily, things are a little more concrete when it comes to powerlifting, and it probably has something to do with the fact that it's easier to objectively measure what actually works, and it's probably a little more difficult to BS your way around if your total is not growing. And when it comes to powerlifting, more or less traditional way of structuring your macro cycle is breaking it into periods of hypertrophy, strength, and taper versus peaking. Now, before going into any specifics on any of this, I just want to say a few words about using percentages or one repetition maximum, because I think it's a little trickier than most people realize, and that's why things don't always work out the way they're supposed to. Now, two suggestions when you're using percentages of one repetition maximum. Number one is you want to use one repetition maximum that you were able to complete fairly recently, and it shouldn't be something that you lifted years ago. Now, the second suggestion is a little less obvious, and in order for you, in my opinion, in order for you to have a successful training cycle while using percentages or one repetition maximum, you might want to keep that macro cycle relatively short. And let me explain why. So let's imagine that you decided to have a hypertrophy block that is 12 weeks long, and during that time you were using weights that are 60 to 75% of your one repetition maximum. Now you have to understand that at the end of that block of training, your one repetition maximum is no longer the same thing, because you did not use weights that are heavy enough during that time to maintain that one repetition maximum. And now if you're trying to use that same number while moving into the strength block, it should be pretty obvious how things will not work out the way they're supposed to. And I know this might sound like I'm splitting hairs here for somebody who's enhanced, but that's a little different, because if you are enhanced, you probably will retain most of your strength during the hypertrophy block, and you probably will retain most of your muscle mass when you are in strength block. But it's a little different when you are drug free, and even very small miscalculations become very unforgiving when you're starting to move weights that are relatively heavy. And that's why if you saw my bench press training program, that training program is only 7 weeks long. And if you don't feel like that's enough to make significant progress, that doesn't mean that you couldn't be doing some work before committing to that training program. And another thing to keep an eye on is the speed of exercise execution. And so, for example, if you feel that your reps are becoming very, very slow this early in training, there's a big chance that you miscalculated, and it's very important for you to make appropriate adjustment in timely manner. Now let's talk about the mesocycles, and we're going to start with the hypertrophy. As we already said, this is the time when you're going to be lifting weights that are 60 to 75% of your one repetition maximum, and you're going to be completing 10 to 6 reps per set. Now it's important to understand that this is not exactly bodybuilding, and to explain this, I have to complicate things for just 1 minute. So there are two different types of hypertrophy. There is a myofibrillar hypertrophy and there is a sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Myofibrillar hypertrophy has to do with building up of the contractile proteins within the muscle cell, while sarcoplasmic hypertrophy has more to do with the accumulation of fluid. And this is something that is explained very well in Olympic weightlifting by Greg Everett if you want to go more in depth. And it should be pretty obvious that myofibrillar hypertrophy is preferred for strength sports, because that's the one that has actually to do with the functional improvements. And we have to also remember that weightlifting and powerlifting have weight classes in it. And unless you still have plenty of room to maneuver within your weight class, this is definitely something that you have to keep an eye on. And it's even more important for martial arts, but there is also one more additional reason why you have to keep an eye on this. So let's imagine that as the size of the muscle cell is increasing, now you have to also picture how the capillary density is also decreasing. And another thing that might take place is the decrease of the concentration of the mitochondria within the muscle cell, at least in the short term. And that's why even if you're fighting as a heavyweight, it's probably not wise for you to bulk up before the fight, because that might lead to the decrease of your endurance. And I think that this is something that happens to Anthony Joshua. So for example, if you saw his fight with Vladimir Klitschko, after he hurt Vladimir for the first time, and then he was trying to finish him, after just throwing few combinations, he got so fatigued that he came close to getting stopped himself. And so once again, this is something that is very important to understand. And to bring it back to this, you have to keep an eye on how high these reps will be, and also understand that very slow reps and very short rest breaks practice in bodybuilding are not necessarily part of this protocol. So now let's talk about the strength mesocycle. And so this is the time when you're going to be using weights that are 70 to 85% of your 1 repetition maximum, and you're going to be completing 3 to 6 reps per set. Now, as you might remember, we said that as you are structuring macro cycle, you want to move from variation to specificity. And so, for example, if you are competing with the sumo style of deadlift, you could still use the conventional deadlift during your hypertrophy block, but now you would have to switch to the sumo style and practice that instead. And the same thing for squats. So for example, if you compete with the low bar position, you could still use the high bar during hypertrophy block for the variation purposes, but now you would switch to the low bar position. And this is also the time when some of your accessories will start to disappear. So now let's talk about taper and peaking. So these things are not exactly the same thing, because every peaking phase is technically a taper, but not every taper is a peaking phase, because peaking phase has specific protocol attached to it. So let's talk about taper first. So as most of you probably know, the point of this is to dissipate as much fatigue as possible during the last week or two immediately prior to the competition, in order to maximize your performance during that competition. And the exact protocol of this will depend on the specific program that you are trying to taper down. But these are some of the general recommendations. And so number one is that the heavier you are, the further away you will have to taper things down to fully recover before the competition. And the second one is that the heavy attempts in more difficult lifts will have to be scheduled away, further away from competition. So for example, your heavy workout in squats will have to be further away from competition than your heavy workout in bench press. And then your heavy workout in deadlift will have to be scheduled further away from competition than your heavy workout in squats. Now, when it comes to peaking, as I said, it has specific protocol attached to it. And so this is when you start lifting weights that are 85 or above of your 1 repetition maximum, and you complete 1 to 3 reps per set. And this is something that Chad Smith talks a lot about, and I consider him to be extremely knowledgeable in the field of powerlifting. But with that being said, I do not believe that this is necessarily appropriate for drug-free athletes. And I believe that in order for you to make this work for drug-free athlete, you have to modify it to such extent that it will no longer resemble anything like this. So personally, I would rather come up to 95% over 6 weeks and then back down and come back to 100% over another 6 weeks, instead of having a 12-week macro cycle and then have all these heavy attempts bunched up all the way at the end. But this is just another reason why I personally prefer shorter macro cycles. When it comes to microcycle, the overall design of the exact training program will greatly depend on the chosen philosophy. So it's very uncommon in powerlifting to hear something like, "Oh, I go by how I feel during my training sessions." And people still actually read books. And once they find something that makes sense to them, that's the training program that we'll be using. And these are just some of the general guidelines that we can point out. And so usually the body part distribution is still taken into account. So original Juggernaut training program or 531 would be good examples of that. So this is roughly speaking what the template would look like. And as you can see, in this context, the upper lower body split actually makes sense, because if you think about it, your deadlift and your squats will have much greater contribution to your total than just bench press. And it actually makes sense to spend so much energy trying to improve those lifts. And this in fact could easily be just a three-way split. But I think in the attempt to sort of balance things out, more and more modern programs include this day now. Now, as far as the accessories, these will usually be the moves that are selected based on specific needs, and it usually has something to do around with working around various sticking points during the competition lifts. So I hope it's pretty easy to recognize the similarities between this training template and the split routines commonly used in bodybuilding, which just illustrates the great influence that bodybuilding has on the Western style of programming for powerlifting. But there is also a whole body approach that is used, and I think programs by Boris Shaker would be most well known in that category. And so if you ever seen those training programs, you can help noticing great resemblance of that style of program to the programming used in USSR Olympic weightlifting. And I spoke about this briefly in one of my previous videos, so let's just elaborate a little more on what that is. So as I mentioned before, back in USSR, thousands of athletes of various weight classes and of different qualifications were observed for very long periods of time, and then that data was summarized and systemized, and optimum ranges of various training parameters were established for athletes of different weight classes and different qualifications. And so then coaches would be able to use that while designing training programs for their athletes. And this is nothing like MRV, for example, because it's not just those things were not just number of lifts, which is what is used to calculate volume in weightlifting, by the way. Those lifts were also total number of lifts were also broken down, how they're going to split between main moves and how they're going to further be split in different loading zones. And so once you have that information, then the total amount of work for a month would be split into weeks, and then weeks would be split into training sessions. And these things are definitely not split uniformly. So some weeks would be high impact weeks, some weeks would be recovery weeks, and so on. And I think the only piece of this information that people are more or less familiar here in the West is the famous prolapse table. I think this is something that is popularized by Louis Simmons here. But do understand that that is only one little small piece of the puzzle, and the whole system is much more complicated. So if you hear that somebody is trying to create a training system just around that table alone, that should raise a lot of questions. And I believe that this is still mostly unknown here in the West, and this is probably the reason why you still hear people talking about using Bulgarian weightlifting system. And so it's interesting to hear how they rationalize that choice. So for example, somebody will say that, oh well, on the days that you are tired, you won't be able to lift as heavy, so that will be like your deload day. And so basically, if you hit the wall while using that training program, don't worry about it, it's actually by design. And also, I don't want to oversimplify that training system, but at the same time, I think it's pretty safe to say that maxing out on all your lifts every day is probably not going to be appropriate for a drug-free athlete. And just to bring this back to powerlifting, Boris Shaker actually does not program a lot of his work in the loading zone of 90 and above. And I think it's pretty safe to assume that the reason for that is that work that you do in loading zones from 70 to 80 or from 80 to 90 has a lot more transferability to your one repetition maximum in powerlifting than it does in weightlifting, because the technique of the competition lifts in powerlifting is not nearly as complicated as it is in weightlifting. Now, believe it or not, I actually tried this. So back in the 90s, I started getting stuck with the abbreviated training methodology, and I started looking for new ways to make progress. And luckily enough, I came across this book. And so this is a manual for USSR Olympic weightlifting. And I know that the first thing that comes to mind when you hear USSR Olympic weightlifting is steroids, but at the same time, as you read this book, you can't help noticing how much logic is there for that methodology. And I think you just have to be knowledgeable enough to make appropriate adjustments to make this work without steroids. So I gave it a shot. And so my preparation block was 5 training sessions a week, and my competition block was 3 training sessions a week, which, by the way, what eventually became my weightlifting training program. And it worked incredibly well. I made insane amount of progress for such short amount of time in all my assistance exercises. Now, I did not make any progress whatsoever in the classic Olympic weightlifting moves, because I was trying to learn them on my own, and that was definitely very foolish because I had many near-death experiences. So I would drop the bar on my back during snatch, I would pass out on the clean, and so on. And that's why I highly discourage that anybody tries to learn those lifts on their own. And luckily I was still very young, and my body was able to tolerate that kind of abuse. But at the same time, even more fortunate was the fact that I was already mature enough to realize that if I don't stop that nonsense, I was probably going to end up in a wheelchair. And so I took that methodology and applied it to powerlifting. And once again, it worked very, very well. And that is something that many years later, after hundreds of modifications, became my second advanced training program. So hopefully now, after watching this video, when you look at that training program, you will be able to recognize how much methodology is included there. And hopefully watching this video will also give you a little more appreciation for good, complete training programs. Because there is a lot of criticism when it comes to training templates these days. And the moment you write something on a piece of paper, it immediately becomes a cookie cutter. And nowadays, everybody wants something highly individualized. And although that would actually make sense for somebody who's very advanced, but at the same time, it's completely unnecessary for somebody like a novice lifter. And if you are a novice lifter, you'd probably be better off finding something like starting strength and then sticking to that training program. Because although that training program might be only 95% optimum specifically for you, but at the same time, it's probably going to be much more optimum than something that you're going to be able to put together all by yourself as a novice lifter. Because as you can see, there's a lot that you have to take into account. And the whole is greater than the sum of its parts when it comes to resistance training. And just like you can't take random pieces of different cars and throw them on a pile and call it an automobile, you can't just take a bunch of exercises and put them all together and call it a training program, because as you can see, it's a little more complicated than that. But at the same time, that's really what makes it all interesting, because without all this, lifting weights is really, I pick things up and I put them down. And I think this is probably the reason why a lot of people who want to start exercising but don't want to bother learning anything about proper training end up quitting in a matter of weeks, because without all this, lifting weights is pretty boring. But unfortunately, most of those people stopped watching this video a long time ago, and none of this applies to you guys. And I firmly believe that those of you who watch the material I have on this channel combined with my books are definitely in top 1% of the gym population when it comes to training knowledge. And I should probably get a pat on the back, which means that you guys should probably like the video and subscribe to the channel. Couple more things before we call it a day here. So number one is, no matter how meticulous you are with your programming, this is not meant to compensate for sloppy form of exercise execution. And I am saying this as a licensed doctor of physical therapy. And you better believe it that every time I walk into the gym, I am watching people trying to get injured. And I actually did observe a few very serious injuries taking place right in front of my eyes. And those injuries were not accidents. And number two is that this is also not meant to be a substitute for hard work. And as you are moving from mesocycle to mesocycle, you should be able to track down how you're implementing progressive overload, which probably means that you're going to have to keep training a lot. Now, I know that this was very concentrated and there might be a lot of questions about this. So, as always, you can go ahead and put it in the comment section, or what I would actually prefer is that you post your questions on the new Facebook group that I just opened, and it's called Big and Strong Without Steroids. Now, I know that most of you guys still prefer to message me directly, and I don't necessarily mind that as long as I'm still able to reply in some sort of timely manner. But at the same time, I think that these discussions are just way more interesting when more people participating, because different people bring different angles to the same topic. So I would highly encourage that you join that group. Now, otherwise, I hope you guys enjoy watching this video as much as I enjoy making it, because this is a very fascinating topic, and it's always very interesting to see how all these seemingly unrelated things such as transmutation and supercompensation come together and become this beautiful thing. So thank you for stopping by, and I'll see you guys next time.